Okay, so I'm Peter Larson with Canada Talks Israel-Palestine. I'm thrilled to have caught Jonathan Cook in Nazareth. Jonathan, thank you very much for spending a few minutes with us.
It's a pleasure, Peter.
Jonathan, it's now just a few days after the Israeli election, which was on Tuesday. It's now Friday afternoon in Nazareth. Top line, what happened?
Well, what happened is what we can see is that Israeli Jewish society is deeply divided. Now, the selling point of this, I think, mainly abroad, is that this is some kind of split over the question of whether Israel wants to make peace with the Palestinians, whether you've got the right-wing Netanyahu camp against a kind of more moderate, peace-orientated camp under Benny Gantz, the former military chief of staff, and his blue and white party. Now, I think that's a misreading of the situation. I think the split here isn't really between a peace camp, or what people are calling a center-left camp, and a right-wing camp. I think it's a split between what one might call, or two camps within the two camps within the right-wing bloc in Israel. So you've got a religious bloc, religious settler bloc that's really headed by Netanyahu. And then you've got a more militaristic right-wing camp under Gantz and his blue and white party. And this is really where the division has come down. So what's interesting in this election is that you've got the nominal kingmaker is Lieberman, Avigdor Lieberman, the former very hawkish defense minister, who has got his small party, Yisrael Beitenu, they've got 8 seats within the 120-member parliament. He looks like he can swing it either way. So he could go with Gantz and make a government with Gantz, or he could go with Netanyahu, that's what he's done in previous elections, and prop up the settler religious camp. Lieberman is very right-wing. So whichever way he pushes it, it's going to be a right-wing government. It could be a more secular right-wing government under Gantz, the general, or it could be a slightly more settler-orientated right-wing government under Netanyahu.
Jonathan, the way a number of observers here read it is that as far as the Palestinian citizens of Israel are concerned, or the Palestinians more generally, that it didn't make any difference if it was Netanyahu or Gantz. Is that the way you read it? There's no difference at all?
I think if you're a Palestinian in the occupied territories, there's not going to be much difference. It won't make much difference either way. I think if you're a Palestinian in Israel, there are some differences. And that's maybe the most interesting aspect of the election. We've seen the Palestinian vote among Palestinian citizens of Israel, those Palestinians who live inside Israel and have citizenship and therefore can vote in the election. We've seen their turnout declining year after year. And then suddenly this election, we saw it turn around. Now, why did it turn around? Well, in part, it turned around because of the relentless incitement from Netanyahu. He was talking about the Palestinian vote. He started this in 2015 when he said that the Palestinian, he called them the Arabs, the Palestinian citizens of Israel, were heading to the polls in droves. Implying that there was something wrong with them exercising their democratic right. And he's really been stepping up that kind of incitement every single election. So the last election, he secretly put monitors inside the Arab polling stations, his own activists, Likud activists, who went into the polling stations with these hidden cameras as a way of kind of voter suppression or intimidation. And then in this election, he stepped it up even further. He's talked about the Palestinians wanting to annihilate us all, women, children, and men. That was the exact quote. That was put out by his Facebook page. It's very difficult to imagine, although he denied he knew it was going to happen. It's very difficult to imagine that he didn't oversee something like that. So he's been sending this message that a Palestinian vote is inherently illegitimate, that the Palestinian minority are conspiring with what he's calling the leftists. He means the Gantz party, if you like, the army-led party. Very difficult to think of them as leftists, really, but that's the way he's selling it. And that this is somehow illegitimate, They shouldn't be exercising their right to vote, and that they're a threat to the Jewish population. Just the vote itself is a threat to the Jewish population. And I think that drove this turnaround in the vote. So you suddenly saw Palestinians who just a few months ago, less than 50% of them voted. Suddenly it's gone up to 60%. And I think a large part of that is a backlash to this kind of incitement. And I think, strangely, paradoxically, Palestinian citizens of Israel have started to realize maybe their vote counts for something, because Netanyahu and the far right are so frightened of it. They think it's a threat to them. And I think people have started to wake up to the fact that Netanyahu really is degrading the discourse in Israel about Palestinian citizens and their rights. There's always been this very big antipathy in Israeli Jewish society to the parties, the Palestinian parties inside the Knesset, having any kind of role or influence. But we've moved from that to suddenly the idea that the voters themselves, Palestinian voters inside Israel, are not part of the democracy and shouldn't be part of the democracy. And I think probably that turnaround in the vote is a way of trying to, the assumption that Gantz isn't as bad as that Gantz is more of a Democrat than Netanyahu is. So that plays out possibly better for Palestinians inside Israel. Does it make a difference for Palestinians in the occupied territories? It's difficult to imagine it does.
Including Gaza?
Especially for Gaza, we have to remember, actually people tend to think of Netanyahu as, because he's right wing, that he's very warlike and so on, but that's not really. Netanyahu's quite cautious when it comes to these kinds of matters of waging wars. He wants stability. He wants to make out that he's Mr. Security, but he doesn't really like wars, which can cause trouble. There's, when a war starts, you never know where it's going to lead. Can lead to backlashes. Ehud Olmert, who initiated the first war in Gaza, the big war back in 2008, 2009, it led to him losing the election and so on. And so Netanyahu has been quite cautious. Compare that to Gantz, who leads the Blue and White Party, the party that came out just ahead of Netanyahu's party in the election. And what did we see there? We saw that that Gantz is the one who's talking very much in terms of one of his selling points in the election. One of his campaign ads was saying that in 2014, how he'd overseen the attack on Gaza, and he'd pushed it back into the Stone Age. So Gantz has really sold himself as being the tough guy who will take on Gaza. So I don't think Palestinians in the occupied territories in Gaza have any particular reason to favor Gantz over Netanyahu. I think the thing that might be more worrying about Netanyahu is he's a cornered prime minister at the moment. He's got these corruption charges hanging over him. Just in 2 weeks' time, he's going to be facing a pre-indictment hearing. Most people assume that the Attorney General has given every indication that he's expecting to indict Netanyahu in 3 big cases, corruption cases. So at the moment, Netanyahu is the caretaker prime minister. He's got a few more weeks before a government emerges, if he's not going to be in it. And if he can't get himself an immunity from prosecution through the other parties passing legislation, which doesn't look so likely now, he could instigate trouble. He may go down.
What could he do? Could he make a provocative attack in Gaza and then say we're at war and so on and so forth?
Exactly, he could do that. And in fact, we discovered very recently he tried to do that last week. He actually tried to postpone the election by waging war in Gaza. So what emerged in the Israeli media is that what Netanyahu was trying to do was trigger an attack on Gaza so he could escalate it and then say this is not the time for us to be having an election. He was foiled because the Attorney General discovered that Netanyahu had got the Security Cabinet to approve this without referring the cabinet to the recommendations of his generals. So the army had said we shouldn't do this, and Netanyahu had kept this from the cabinet, which is why they approved it. And the Attorney General then halted that process and said, you're trying to do this for electoral reasons, and this is why it was stopped. So he has form already. Just last week he was trying to do it. So there's every reason to fear he may try and do it again. Okay. So these are dangerous times for Palestinians.
Jonathan, just back for the Palestinian citizens of Israel, last year, maybe now it was a year and a half ago, Israel passed this nation-state law that legalized the predominant position of Jews in Israel. Was that an issue that Gantz or they came up in the election at all? Was that an election issue? Because there was some criticism within Israel of that law at the time it went through, if I'm not mistaken.
Sure. I mean, that was something that split the more religious, biblically orientated members of the government, the settler and national religious communities, it's called here, and the secular right, and what is called the center here. So the secular politicians were against this law, not because really they were against what it was doing. In fact, that law didn't change a great deal. Most of the legislation, the elements of the legislation were already in effect inside Israel and have been really from the very early years of the state. But they were more worried about the formalization of this kind of anti-democratic legislation, the fact that it was being made so public through this basic law, kind of constitutional type law. So there was some resistance from people like Gantz. Now, one of the conditions, for instance, that Ayman Odeh, the leader of the Joint List, that's the coalition of Palestinian parties in the Knesset, they've got 13 seats. So they're actually the third largest party. Now, one of the things they've been saying is that they will only recommend Gantz for creating the coalition. They will back him, and he needs their backing if he's going to form a government. Probably needs their backing, unless he can get Netanyahu's Likud party to come into a unity government with them. If what Ayman Odeh has been saying is, if you want me to recommend you as prime minister, I need you to say that you will reverse the nation-state law, that you'll repeal it. We haven't had any view from Gantz about that. He's made sympathetic noises about it. I don't think he likes the legislation, but it's unclear whether he will go as far as repealing it. There's something interesting here, though, because Ayman Odeh, the head of the Joint List, now has this pivotal position. Really, this is the first time we've seen the Palestinian leadership in the Knesset suddenly really having a role where whatever happens, they are going to be critical. So one of the things they can do, as Ayman Odeh has said he may do, is recommend Gantz to be the man who tries to create the coalition. He gets the first shot at trying to create a coalition. They back him for that. That's very significant in itself. The other thing, though, is if Gantz decides not to go with what they're calling a center-left, I think it's a mistake to call it a center-left coalition, but this coalition between the generals and these more centrist parties, backed by the Joint List, the Palestinian parties, if Gantz decides not to go down this path, and there's a lot of problems for him doing this, because Netanyahu will say this government is being propped up by the Palestinians, who are enemies of the state and traitors, a fifth column and so on. He will use this language to try and delegitimize such a move. If Gantz decides not to go with the outside support of the Palestinian parties to create a coalition government, then his only other option is to go into a unity government with Netanyahu's party. Netanyahu may be still leading that party, or Gantz may insist that Netanyahu step aside to let somebody else take it on. But either way, if he creates this unity government, that leaves the Joint List, the Palestinian parties, as the official opposition. Because the two biggest parties, Netanyahu's Likud party and Gantz's Blue and White party, would then become a unity government. The third party, largest party, is the Palestinian party, the Joint List. They become the official opposition. Now, this is creating all sorts of ructions already inside Israel, because it's unheard of, the idea that the official opposition might be the Palestinian party led by Ayman Odeh. That gives Ayman Odeh all sorts of privileges. It means that he gets security clearance, he gets security briefings from the prime minister, from the generals in the army. He gets to meet heads of state when they visit. It means that he gets a Shin Bet bodyguard. He gets to make a response to the prime minister in sort of the equivalent of prime minister's question time, and so on. So this is a huge deal. It suddenly makes Ayman Odeh one of the pivotal figures in the Knesset. Everybody's panicking in the Israeli Jewish establishment about this idea. It would just really undermine the whole idea of this being a Jewish state. And so there's a lot of concern, and people are now talking about the fact that maybe they can manipulate things so that the third largest party doesn't become the official opposition in that case. How they would do that, I don't know, but they're talking about it already.
Jonathan, we know that Netanyahu is a bit of a magician, so we'll see what he's able to do going forward. Jonathan Cook in Nazareth, thank you very much for spending some time with us today, and we'll all be watching carefully to see the implications, as you say, both for the Palestinians under occupation in Gaza and in the West Bank, and for the Palestinian citizens of Israel themselves. Thank you so much, Jonathan.
It was a pleasure.